Imagine having the power to do anything you want, but you're just terminally bored. For Roman emperors, this wasn't a hypothetical, it was a Tuesday. And it resulted in them declaring war on the ocean, making a monkey a military commander, and 30 other acts of pure, unadulterated imperial idiocy that prove absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it makes you unbelievably dumb. 1. When you've got so much cash that shiny things just don't do it for you anymore, you've reached Caligula levels of jaded. He was so over his massive pearl collection that he came up with a new pastime, making the ocean richer. He'd just scoop up handfuls of these priceless gems, each one capable of funding a small army, and just yeet them into the Mediterranean, probably cackling like a supervillain. This is the ancient Roman version of a tech billionaire buying Twitter just to see what happens when you set it on fire. It's a brand of boredom that only absolute unchecked power can produce, and frankly, it's almost impressive in its sheer stupidity. 2. If you think sitting through your nephew's terrible high school band recital is torture, try attending a Nero concert. This man was so deeply convinced of his own musical genius that he'd stage 12-hour epics of his own awful singing and cringe-worthy poetry. But here's the kicker. He knew you'd want to leave. So, he'd have his guards lock the doors. You were a captive audience. It was less of a concert and more of a musical hostage situation. Things got so desperate that people started staging their own medical emergencies, dramatically fainting so their accomplices could carry their unconscious bodies outside to freedom. Nero probably saw this and thought, "My God, my art is so powerful it's rendering them unconscious. I'm a legend." 3. While other emperors were busy with boring stuff like infrastructure and legal reform, Emperor Carinus was perfecting the art of the hostile work environment. His nightly ritual? Hosting a private fight club in the palace where the only other members were his own bodyguards. This created the ultimate professional paradox for his security team. If you throw the fight, he might see you as a weak link and have you replaced. But if you actually land a solid right hook on the Emperor of Rome, your career, and probably your life, are over. It's the worst HR initiative in history. You can just imagine the guards the next day, all sporting fat lips and black eyes, trying to look intimidating while their boss sits on the throne with a smug look, bragging about his undefeated record. 4. Caligula, a true pioneer in terrible ideas, must have thought traditional Roman sports were getting a bit predictable. His groundbreaking solution was to swap out the game ball for a live and presumably very confused octopus. Just try to wrap your head around that. You and your friends are trying to play a game, maybe something like volleyball, but the ball is a writhing, 8-limbed sea creature that's actively trying to ink you in the face. It's a chaotic mess of flailing tentacles, panicked athletes, and a very unhappy cephalopod. For Caligula, the goal wasn't to score points. It was to see how many senators he could get sucker-punched by Calamari. The post-game cleanup alone must have been a nightmare. 5. It seems Caligula's emotional development stalled at around age 5, and he decided to make the entire Roman government his personal playground. One of his go-to activities was forcing the most respected and elderly senators to play hide-and-seek. But he added a little twist. The game was played at night, inside his massive, completely dark palace. This wasn't a game. It was a psychological thriller. Imagine being a 75-year-old statesman named Publius, stuffed into a vase, trying not to breathe too loud as you hear the footsteps of your insane, all-powerful emperor echoing down the hall. What are the stakes here? If he finds you, is it a playful gotcha, or is it a sword through the pottery because you were too easy to find? 6. So, Emperor Caligula is having a rough time. His grand invasion of Britain turns out to be a complete failure. A sane leader would regroup and strategize. Caligula, however, marched his legions to the nearest beach, pointed a trembling finger at the English Channel, and ordered his men to attack the water. He literally declared war on the sea god Neptune. Picture thousands of heavily armed Roman soldiers, the most disciplined fighting force in the world, just furiously stabbing the waves. After they had sufficiently defeated the ocean, He proclaimed a great victory and ordered them to gather seashells as trophies of war. It's the ancient equivalent of losing a video game and then smashing your controller, except your controller is an entire army. 7. Some people get really into their hobbies. Emperor Commodus, on the other hand, let his hobby consume his entire identity. He was so utterly obsessed with the legend of Hercules that he just decided one day that he was Hercules. He'd stroll around the palace wearing a lion skin, carrying a massive club, and demanding that everyone address him as a literal god. He even legally changed his name on official documents to reflect his new divine status. This was not a phase, it was his entire reality. Imagine him trying to negotiate a peace treaty by challenging the other side's ambassador to an arm wrestling match. His advisors just had to go along with it and pray he didn't ask them to help him clean out any giant filthy stables. 8. This right here is the moment Roman dignity officially died. Commodus, not satisfied with just dressing up as Hercules, decided the Senate needed to witness his true artistic range. In the middle of official state business, he would occasionally strip completely naked, roll around in the dirt, and begin to impersonate a monkey. We're talking the full performance, hooting, screeching, and crawling on all fours in front of the most powerful men in the known world. And what was their response? They had no choice but to sit there in stunned silence and then give a standing ovation to their naked, primate-impersonating emperor. When your political leaders are forced to applaud a man pretending to be an ape, you know the empire is running on fumes. 9. Caligula is back on his corporate synergy kick, and this time he's shaking up the executive board. He adored his horse, Incitatus, more than any person in his empire, and honestly, who can blame him? The horse lived in a marble stable with an ivory manger and ate oats mixed with gold flakes. Then, Caligula decided it was time for a career change. He seriously announced his intention to make his horse a consul, one of the two highest offices in Rome. This wasn't just a quirky promotion, it was the ultimate insult to the entire political system. It was his way of looking at the Senate and declaring, "My horse, who literally eats hay for a living, is more qualified to run this empire than any of you." The most hilarious part? He was probably right. 10. Caligula was the type of person who would lose a staring contest with a statue and then have it demolished for its insolence. One afternoon, he decided he had a personal beef with the color blue. Not a mild dislike, mind you, but a deep philosophical hatred. He immediately issued an imperial decree banning it. This meant that, technically, the sky and the sea were now illegal entities. How do you even enforce a law like that? Did he dispatch legions to write tickets to the horizon? This is a level of pure, unadulterated rage against the laws of physics that is almost poetic. He was the original guy yelling at a cloud, except he had the power to make the cloud's very existence a crime. 11. All right, let's turn the weirdness up to 11 and snap the knob off. Emperor Domitian decided to host a dinner party, and the theme he chose was crippling psychological terror. He ushered his guests into a pitch-black dining room. Everything was black. The walls, the furniture, even the food, which was probably dyed with squid ink. Then, as their eyes adjusted, each guest discovered a miniature tombstone placed at their setting, engraved with their own name. He let them marinate in that silent, cold sweat-inducing horror for what must have felt like an eternity. Then, just when they were fully resigned to their impending doom, he burst in with a big smile and yelled, "Surprise! That's not a prank. That's psychological warfare disguised as a social gathering." 12. Most great art is born from passion, sorrow, or profound beauty. In Caligula's court, however, the official muse was his own foot. He was so ridiculously proud of his big toes that he commissioned the greatest poets in the land to write epic odes in their honor. Just imagine being a master of verse, a man whose words could move mountains, now forced to find a new adjective to describe a callus. "Oh, toe of the emperor, so regal and stout, the grandest of digits, there can be no doubt." You can almost hear their souls quietly weeping as they tried to find a word that rhymes with bunion. It was the ultimate artistic humiliation, a black hole of creativity from which no dignity could escape. 13. Elagabalus had so much money and so little to do that he decided to play God, but with a budget and a severe lack of imagination. He issued a public challenge, offering a massive reward to anyone who could invent an entirely new species of animal. After countless failed attempts, some brilliant con artist showed up at the palace. The guy had simply taken a common lizard, crudely glued a pair of bird wings onto its back, and presented it as the rare and magnificent flying lizard. And Elagabalus, a man whose taste was permanently stuck on idiotic, fell for it completely. He probably named the guy his Minister of Fictional Biology on the spot. This was a man actively weaponizing his wealth to make reality itself stupider. 14. Everyone has a favorite physical feature. For Emperor Commodus, it wasn't his chiseled jaw or his heroic physique. It was one of his ears. He was so profoundly proud of this specific ear that he felt the entire population of Rome needed to share in its glory. His solution? He commissioned a 50-foot-tall solid gold statue of it to be placed in the city center. Not a statue of himself, mind you, just a colossal, gleaming, golden ear. The sheer, baffling specificity of this act of vanity is breathtaking. It's like a modern billionaire building a monument to their favorite elbow. What were citizens supposed to do? Stand before it in awe and say, "The lobe on that thing is truly magnificent." 15. If you think your company's mandatory fun days are awkward, you should have seen Caligula's game nights. He took chess, a game of quiet intellectual pursuit, and decided it needed a healthy dose of human suffering. He forced his top generals to play against each other on a giant board, but instead of using carved pieces, they used actual soldiers. Here's the twist. Whenever a piece was captured, the real soldier it represented was immediately dragged off the board and given a horrible, humiliating punishment, like cleaning the sewers for a month. This turned a simple game into a high-stakes ethical nightmare. Every move carried the weight of some poor guy's immediate future. Your bad checkmate just doomed a legionary named Gaius to a week of misery. 16. Elagabalus wasn't really an emperor. He was more like a circus ringmaster who had accidentally inherited an empire. He found his private zoo to be a bit of a snooze, so he decided the animals needed to earn their keep. He took his largest, most ferocious bears and trained them to be a dancing troupe. But the true stroke of his moronic genius was their costumes. He made the bears wear the actual sacred helmets of his own Praetorian Guard. Let that image sink in. The symbol of Rome's most elite fighting force was now a ridiculous hat for a clumsy waltzing bear at a palace party. Imagine the silent, soul-crushing shame of a guard watching his uniform being used as a prop in the world's dumbest animal act. 17. Elagabalus is back, and his maturity level has not improved. During the most solemn and critical meetings of the Roman Senate, when the fate of nations hung in the balance, he would amuse himself by secretly dropping live mice down the backs of the senators' togas. Picture the scene. A stoic, respected elder is delivering a powerful oration on tax policy, only to suddenly leap into the air, shrieking as a small rodent scurries up his spine. The entire legislative body would dissolve into chaos as grown men frantically shook out their robes. For Elagabalus, governing was just a backdrop for his own low-budget prank show. 18. Nero's ego was a force of nature. It was so vast and all-consuming that simple marble statues of himself just didn't cut it anymore. They were too inanimate. So he commissioned his engineers to build the world's first animatronics. He had statues of himself constructed with internal mechanisms that allowed them to mechanically wave at passers-by. This is the ultimate cry for help from a man so desperate for attention that he needed his own inanimate effigies to acknowledge his presence. Imagine being an ordinary Roman citizen walking to the market, and a 10-foot-tall stone Nero gives you a slow, creepy robotic wave. You don't wave back. You just pick up the pace and hope it doesn't start following you. 19. What does the most powerful man in the world do in his spare time? If you're Emperor Domitian, you retreat to your private chambers for your favorite hobby, serial fly murder. He would spend hours a day, every day, meticulously hunting and capturing individual flies, only to impale them one by one with a sharpened pen. This wasn't just idle swatting, it was a focused, almost meditative ritual of insect execution. His guards would stand outside his door, listening to the buzz, the sudden silence, and the quiet grunt of satisfaction. It's like discovering the CEO of a major corporation spends his afternoons methodically deflating packing peanuts. What did his staff tell visitors? The emperor will be with you shortly. He's currently engaged in a high-stakes standoff with a particularly agile fruit fly. 20. Elagabalus viewed his role as emperor as the director of a never-ending, deeply humiliating play. He issued a decree that for all official state dinners, the serving staff was to be comprised exclusively of senators dressed as mythological creatures. This was not a suggestion. Imagine trying to discuss a military campaign while the Secretary of the Treasury, crammed awkwardly into a cheap centaur outfit with a droopy horse rear, tries to refill your goblet. Or trying to ask for more bread from the Minister of Agriculture, who is sweating profusely in a pair of fuzzy goat legs and plastic horns. It was a brilliantly twisted way to remind every powerful person in Rome that he could strip them of their dignity at a moment's notice. 21. Just when you thought Elagabalus had exhausted all avenues of insane cruelty, he looked at the Colosseum and thought, this needs a little more chaos. During a sold-out gladiatorial event with thousands of spectators packed into the stands, he gave a signal. On his command, his staff began dumping baskets filled with poisonous snakes from the roof onto the unsuspecting crowd below. This wasn't a targeted assassination. It was pure, unadulterated mayhem for his own amusement. He was probably sitting in his imperial box, casually snacking on grapes, watching with detached curiosity as a panicked stampede of his own citizens tried to escape a sudden horrifying snake rain. It was performance art for a psychopath. 22. After his revolutionary plan to make his horse a high-ranking politician, Caligula decided to double down on his animals in government initiative. For one chaotic day, he officially appointed his pet monkey as the supreme commander of the Praetorian Guard. He even had a tiny custom-tailored uniform made for the occasion, complete with a miniature gladius the monkey probably used to scratch its back. The hardened, veteran commanders of Rome's most elite soldiers were then forced to take their daily orders from an animal that communicated primarily through shrieking and flinging its own feces. Imagine the look on a general's face as he's forced to salute a capuchin who is currently trying to eat its own helmet. 23. Most emperors waged war on foreign enemies. Emperor Domitian, always an innovator, declared war on a much more persistent foe, his own shadow. This wasn't a metaphor. He would literally spend his afternoons in the palace gardens, sword in hand, engaged in a furious duel with the dark shape that followed him on the ground. He would lunge, parry, and shout taunts at it, apparently for its cowardice and refusal to fight fair. The palace guards just had to stand there and pretend that watching the leader of the free world fight a battle against basic optics was a perfectly normal part of their job. You have to wonder if he ever declared victory, only for the shadow to treacherously reappear when he turned his back. 24. If you think your office team-building exercises are cringeworthy, be thankful you never served in the Senate under Emperor Septimius Severus. As a mandatory prerequisite to any important state meeting, he would lock all the senators inside a large chicken coop. The doors would not be opened until every single one of them, the most powerful and aristocratic men in the empire, began to cluck convincingly like chickens. You can just picture the scene. Distinguished statesmen in their fine togas, squatting in the straw, awkwardly practicing their bok-boks. It was a bizarre power play designed to remind them that at the end of the day, he could make them act like barnyard animals whenever the mood struck. 25. If you think modern influencers are desperate for attention, allow me to introduce you to Emperor Nero. He was so consumed by main character syndrome that he hired a personal troupe of musicians to follow him everywhere and provide a real-time score for his life. Imagine him walking into the Senate, and a guy with a lyre plays a dramatic entrance theme. He'd be trying to solve a grain shortage, and a flutist would start playing some thoughtful, pensive melody in the corner. You just know he had different musical cues for every emotion. A sudden cymbal crash for when he was angry, a sad violin for when he felt misunderstood. It's the peak of narcissism. Not just living your life, but producing it live, with a terrified orchestra trying to keep up. 26. Emperor Numerian was a poet, a man of letters, but he had a very specific artistic problem. He found papyrus to be incredibly uninspiring. It was just too flat. So he sought out a new, more dynamic medium for his masterpieces, the soles of his advisors' feet. While his most senior officials were trying to deliver urgent reports about barbarian invasions, Numerian would be on the floor, merrily tickling their feet with a quill as he inscribed a haiku about their calluses. Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required by that advisor. You're trying to brief the emperor on a plague, but you can't because he's composing a sonnet on your heel, and you're desperately trying not to kick the ruler of the world squarely in the jaw. 27. Elagabalus decided to bless his subjects with the thrill of a lottery, but with his own uniquely sadistic twist. He called it the imperial lottery, and the grand prize was legitimately life-changing, freedom from debt or even slavery. The catch? Every single other ticket was also a prize. Prizes included such wonderful items as a basket of angry wasps, 6 dead fish, or the privilege of being publicly humiliated for a day. This transformed a game of hope into the most twisted form of psychological torture imaginable. It was a 1 in a million shot at a new life and a near certainty of winning a box of scorpions. He was less an emperor and more the universe's cruelest game show host. 28. As a military tactician, Caligula's ideas were, let's say, outside the box. In one of his most infamous strategic maneuvers, he ordered an entire legion to march in reverse for a solid week. This wasn't a disciplinary action. He just thought it would be hilarious and might confuse the enemy. The only people who were confused were his own elite troops, who were now stumbling over each other, backing into trees, and generally creating the most disorganized military formation in history. It turned the dreaded Roman army into a chaotic, backwards-walking disaster. The enemy probably saw them coming from a mile away and was too busy laughing to even bother drawing their swords. 29. Emperor Nero, the ultimate artiste, apparently gazed upon the sky one day and was deeply offended by the color palette of Rome's pigeons. They were just too gray, too mundane for his refined tastes. His grand solution was to issue an imperial decree. Every single pigeon in the city had to be captured and dyed purple. Just think about the sheer manpower and resources dedicated to this. He essentially created a new branch of government whose sole purpose was to chase down flying rats with buckets of dye. It is the absolute pinnacle of having too much power, too much time, and not a single shred of common sense. The city must have looked fabulous, though. 30. We've already established that Elagabalus possessed the sense of humor of a block toilet. After perfecting the art of the state-sponsored farting contest, he turned his attention to the other end of the digestive tract. He invented what can only be described as the Roman belching Olympics. Following a decadent feast, he would force his noble guests to compete for the title of Imperial Belch Champion. You can just picture some poor servant acting as a judge, dutifully taking notes on volume, duration, and overall artistic flair. A respectable effort from Senator Claudius, but it lacked the raw power of his performance last week. He was on a one-man mission to systematically destroy every last molecule of dignity in the empire. 31. Let's talk about Emperor Elagabalus, who was essentially a college frat boy who accidentally inherited the world. For him, the height of sophisticated entertainment wasn't theater or philosophy. It was a farting competition. At his own lavish state banquets, surrounded by the most powerful men in Rome, he would officially kick off a contest to see who could produce the most magnificent flatulence. There were probably unspoken rules about technique and delivery. This wasn't just a silly game. It was a command performance. The choice was simple: participate in the Emperor's gas-passing Grand Prix, or risk facing a far more permanent form of wind. This is what happens when your empire's most pressing policy debate is about who ate beans for lunch. 32. Every great leader needs a trusted advisor. Emperor Caracalla had one too, but his was a small, mangled piece of a child's teddy bear. He took this scrap of fluff with him everywhere, not as a memento, but as his chief strategist. During critical war councils, with generals pointing at maps, Caracalla would pause the entire meeting, hold up the bear fragment, and ask for its opinion. He then forced his most battle-hardened commanders to formally address the piece of stuffing and ask for its tactical input. This is a level of madness that is truly mind-boggling. These powerful men had to stand there, look a button-eye in its cold, dead stare, and pretend they were receiving strategic genius. It was government by stuffed animal. And there you have it, 32 exhibits of pure imperial brain failure. But we know the history books are overflowing with this stuff, and we couldn't fit it all in. So, the real question is, which act of monumental Roman stupidity are you absolutely furious we didn't include? I want to see the comments section filled with the stories we missed. If this catalog of madness entertained you, execute the like button and subscribe for more historical insanity.